obviously Simon Rosendahl would have done a better job. Because it is his job to moderate and do that in a challenging way. And also because I did not expect to moderate here, I am not very well prepared. But I hope with your help that I also can survive this next part of this afternoon. And especially the discussion after the two speakers will be challenging. But I hope you all will help me in also bringing that to a good end. Our first speaker of this second session in the afternoon is Henk Westhoek. And he is affiliated with the Planbureau voor de Leefomgeving of the Netherlands. His topic is poultry farming and the environment, challenges and options. And he is, I think, an authority in talking about that. He's a program leader and a senior researcher at this Planbureau. Very much into research into the agriculture and the feed business. So, Henk, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me for this meeting. And I would like to congratulate them with a very well chosen theme. And also with, I think, the location where we are is quite suitable in the sense that it gives an idea of space and of the mission we have. And then, of course, we have to think back of Wubbe Ockels, the first Dutch astronaut who just died this weekend, and who gave us two missions, actually. One is to be optimistic, and the second one is to respect the planetary boundaries and to come up with solutions, because there's only one planet Earth, like he saw from space, so we have to be very careful with this planet. I will tell you something about poultry farming and the environment, both on the challenges side, and I will give some ideas about the options and opportunities, but of course much more can be said about that. Well, I listed down some challenges we have, like has already been said, and I will come back to that a little bit. There's a growing population worldwide, increasingly welfare, especially in Asia, you see that much. And well, we will be expected millions of people more in the middle class in the coming 10 years. So that will be really, and all these people want to eat meat and dairy, etc. So there will be a fast-growing demand for animal products. Well, the good thing about poultry, as you probably all know, is that the feed conversion is generally much higher, much more than for pigs and ruminants. But on the other hand, poultry are much more depending on edible products like pig and ruminants are. Another big challenge, I will come back to that as well, is the recycling of nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, but also other elements. There's a major concern, I will not speak too much about it, regarding animal welfare and also regarding zoonosis, but also we'll just treat it slightly, but not as a main subject. So I will focus, first I will tell you something about the main environmental challenges. Secondly, something more in depth about the global developments. Then I will highlight some issues around land use and biodiversity, about nitrogen use and emissions. And finally, I come back to the opportunities and options. Well, if we look at the environment, what are actually the big global themes? And Mr. Rockström from the Swedish Resilience Center, he made a nice article in Nature about 4 years ago, in which he developed this idea of planetary boundaries. And then he tried to map out for the different themes for which aspects we are already trespassing these boundaries. And then he said, well, for biodiversity, we are really trespassing those boundaries because of the high rate of biodiversity loss globally. For climate change, a little bit, not really far beyond, but we are already past that boundary. And also, maybe astonishing for you, is for the nitrogen cycle. We are already trespassing this planetary boundary. And these are exactly the main three themes for which agriculture in combination with land use is very important. And if you look at biodiversity loss, then, well, if you look at globally at the total biodiversity loss, then about 60% of that loss can be related to agriculture and food production. And half of this loss can be attributed to livestock production. So there's really a big influence, of course, of the whole food sector and food production on the loss of biodiversity. And also on nitrogen, on the nitrogen cycle, of course, there's a big impact of agriculture and specifically of nitrogen, of livestock production on the nitrogen cycle. Well, and how are these related to the nitrogen, to the livestock production? Well, it's a simple diagram showing shows this to you. Very important in this diagram are actually feed and manure, because feed is very much related, of course, the feed production to land use, and feed is also related, like manure, to nitrogen. And together they feed into both to the nitrogen emissions to the environment, but also to greenhouse gas emissions, and finally leading up to impact on biodiversity loss. Well, if we focus then more on the livestock production and then on the feed components for the EU, we made this diagram to explore how much land is actually being used for livestock production within Europe. And there we discriminated the 6 types of animal production, and we also looked into, sorry, this is on greenhouse gases, the next one is on land use. This is on greenhouse gases, showing how much greenhouse gases are related to animal production. And the lowest bar gives you for arable for food. So you see all the arable for food we produce in Europe does not only produces about 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions related to agriculture, where 85% is related to, or almost 90% is related to livestock production. And of course, within livestock production, beef and dairy production are very dominant, partially related to the enteric fermentation processes in ruminants. Well, if we then look into the global challenges, well, like has been said, the total amount of animal protein is expected to increase globally, not so much from the Western countries, because they already have a high intake of animal protein, but especially from the emerging and developing countries, it is projected to increase. But which this graph very nicely shows is the amount of people now living on a high diet, a high protein diet, and on a low protein diet. And you could imagine if the whole rectangle had to be filled with consumption, that would mean that we have to produce 3 or 4 times as much meat and dairy and fish in order to arrive at the same level as the United States level in 2030. And we see that already, of course, happening. This is partly the past trend for the last 10 years, but also the projection for the coming 10 years by the FAO OECD. And there you see that poultry meat is really the fastest increasing type of meat or animal product. Second, followed by milk, and then pig and beef. But especially poultry meat is expected to grow very fast over the coming 10 years. And well, the main increase, of course, like you can expect, is not in the EU in poultry production, but it is partly in developing countries or emerging countries like Brazil, China, also India, but also in the United States. And of course, to feed all those animals, we need more feed production, and that you see in this graph. This is the amount of coarse cereals being produced globally, and what is the fate of those cereals. And you see that for the coarse cereals, of course not for all cereals, but for the coarse cereals, that human consumption is only a minor fraction, and a major fraction is being used to produce feed. And you see also that especially in developing countries, this feed use is expected to increase significantly over the coming 10 years. And you also see that especially for developed countries, there's a high use of coarse grains, especially corn, in use being for biofuel production. Well, what's the issue then about land use and biodiversity? Well, good fertile agricultural land is scarce globally. There's a lot of fertile land being lost has been lost or will be lost in the coming decades because of land degradation, because of urban development. And well, quite typically, most cities are in fertile regions, so when they expand, they typically expand on fertile soils because they are based in valleys or in deltas or in volcanic areas. On the other hand, we see also land abandonment, especially in Europe, because of issues around labor productivity. But the same is happening, for instance, in China, where some parcels are now too small to be cultivated. So we see a lot of land abandonment because of high labor prices. We see competing claims, like the last diagram already showed, for instance, for the production of biofuels, or for forests, or for fiber, for cotton, feed, food, so the 4 or 5 F's you can see there. And this all leads, of course, to an expansion of agricultural land, and that leads to the loss of additional loss of biodiversity. And one thing, of course, you can do about it is to increase crop yields, which has been done over the last 40 to 50 years. But now you see that the crop yield increase is slowing down, and then as a result, that the amount of land being converted into agricultural land is increasing. It used to be 2 million hectares for a long time per year, which the annual conversion rates, so about the size of the Dutch agricultural land use, but now it's about 8 million hectares per year. But if you do look at the global picture around cropland, this is the cropland area around 1800, and here's the area at present. You see a vast increase in cropland. I will show you again. So whole continents have been, well, were not used for cropland production 200 years ago, and you see the vast extension of land use. And well, I'm a soil scientist by training, and as a soil scientist, I do not count in years or in decades, but if you talk about sustainable use of soil, you talk about centuries actually. So, and it's quite a scary idea that about half of our cropland area worldwide has only been used for 100 or 200 years. So it's hard to judge whether this is really a sustainable use or not. And well, of course, not only, well, unless we invent something like wheat from the factory, we need this cropland for many, many years ahead. So we really have to be very careful how to use this cropland. Well, talking about land use and livestock production, in this graph we laid out the land use within the EU, a bit similar like the greenhouse gas emissions. Again, at the lower bar, the arable area for food production, so for the wheat we consume as bread, or the potatoes or the vegetables. And this is about 16 million hectares, which means that about only half of the cropland area in the EU is being used for direct food consumption, and the other half more or less is being used for feed production. And that's combined with the grassland areas, natural areas, but also more intensive grassland areas, brings us to the fact that about 2/3 of the agricultural land within Europe is being used for livestock production. And then mainly, well, half of it is cropland, half of it is grassland. Well, within this larger scheme, you see that poultry and laying hens do not take up the most land, but of course they take up a lot of cropland, whereas, for example, dairy and beef and also sheep are partly being produced on rough grazing land or intensive grasslands. Which also can be, if you look more carefully at the picture, it's a little bit hard to see, but that's why I'll tell you that actually soybean, which is very high on the political agenda, is not the major land use being needed for poultry or laying hen production or for pig production, but actually it's the cereal production which is the major land use impact of this livestock, this kind of livestock production. Well, if we then look at the total agricultural the livestock production, and we look at the amount of land we need per kilogram of protein, we have here laid out the different types of animal products. So on the very high end, you see the extensive beef production, and then more down to the side, you see how much land is being used for. No, the amount of land you need for 1 kilogram of protein for pigs or for poultry, etc. Well, there we see that, of course, that the plant-based vegetable production needs less land use per kilogram of protein compared to eggs and dairy and poultry meat will more or less fall in the same category. And then you see pig meat using about twice as much land as poultry meat. And on top you see, of course, the beef production. Well, then the first topic being nitrogen. Well, nitrogen is a little bit a forgotten element. I mean, we talk a lot about greenhouse gas emissions, we talk a lot about biodiversity loss, but very few people are aware of the impact of nitrogen on the environment. About 2 years ago, this report was being published called the European Nitrogen Assessment. It's about this size, the book. Well, the whole issue about nitrogen is quite well laid out in that book. And this diagram is originating from this book. And nitrogen plays a very important role in many environmental aspects. So, for example, due to the emission of N2O, of nitrous oxide, nitrogen contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions. Nitrogen has an impact on soil quality. Nitrogen has a big impact on water quality, both of fresh water but also of marine waters, not only in Europe, of course, but for example, all the problems you see in the coastal zones in China or in the Philippines are mainly related to nitrogen emissions from cities, but also from agriculture to rivers and to river systems. And also for air quality, of course, nitrogen has a big impact. Well, here we see the nitrogen flows within the EU agriculture sector. Well, you can look it down in a recently published paper, but there are two main messages. The first one is that if you compare the inputs, especially in the form of nitrogen fertilizer, with the outputs, that only about 20% of the input arrives finally at the plate of the consumer, and the rest is lost in between. And part of it is not in non-harmful losses in the form of N2, but quite some harmful losses in the form of ammonia to the air and nitrate to groundwaters. And the second thing is that the importance of the livestock production within the whole nitrogen cycle, and about 80% of the total nitrogen losses from the EU agriculture are related to livestock production. So, like with land use and like with greenhouse gas emissions, the livestock sector is a major player in nitrogen losses. And this is partly related to the fact that all the nitrogen losses to the concentration of livestock in certain areas. And on the left-hand side, you see the combination of all livestock, and on the right-hand side of poultry. And then you see that poultry is a bit less concentrated than, for example, the pig production, but still there are areas where there's a high concentration of poultry production, and also quite typically almost the same areas where also the pig production is being concentrated, like the southern part of the Netherlands and the northern part of Belgium, Brittany and France, the eastern part of Spain, the Po Valley in Italy, etc. So there's some hotspots of livestock production, and those hotspots mean that there's a lot of import of feed into those areas, and that means that the manure is not properly recycled and being used as a fertilizer to be used on the fields. Well, if we talk then more in terms of options and opportunities, there's not actually a single solution if we want to do something about all the environmental issues. We see there's a combination actually of four directions. Well, the first one is smarter diets, very important. I mean, if you would eat a little bit less meat and dairy, or a different kind of meat and dairy, then, well, in some cases our health might profit, and it would also mean a more resource-efficient type of food production. On the bottom side, we see a fairer sharing of cost and benefits, but also other social elements are related to that, like, for example, like Henk Wilschot told us, and also Professor De Kuyper from Belgium, the importance of reconnecting the society back to how agriculture and food production are being organized, and what it means, and which choices can be made in that respect. And in the central part, there are two directions for production, being smart local on the one hand, mainly aimed at better animal welfare, but also at lower local impacts, like for example emissions from stables. But on the other hand, we have to respect the global issues, like for example land use and greenhouse gas emissions, and for that we need higher crop yields or better feed efficiency. And sometimes there are synergies between smart local and smart global, but sometimes there are trade-offs between the two, like I will tell you in a minute. Well, if you look first at the first component, our diets, here you see the typically European diet, the average European diet, expressed in the amount of proteins which are being consumed. And you see the trend from the 1960 to 2010. And there you see that we consume about, on average, about 70% more protein than is actually needed concerning the health recommendations. And you also see that with vegetable, you almost already reach the amount you need, and all the livestock elements are on top of that. And you also see an increase, especially in the livestock products. But of course, a strong increase in poultry meat. Well, like you all know, in the 60s there was hardly any poultry meat consumption, and since then it has about increased by a factor 8. And well, one of the reasons, of course, is that we consume now more meat and dairy, is that changes in diets and also new recipes, like for instance salad. About 20 years ago, the salad you bought was usually just plain salad, and now there are many salads you buy, and there's a lot of poultry meat on top of the salad. So in general, it's and there's also was both for human health, of course, as for the environment. It's the quantity that matters. I mean, there are no sustainable products or healthy products, but it's more like the combination you put on your plate, which determines the environmental impact, but also the health impact. And sugar is, of course, not a. I mean, you can eat sugar. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a safe product to eat, but it's about the quantity of sugar you eat. That's true for all components within the diet. And like I said, it's very important to reconnect consumers with farmers and farming again. Well, there's then the tension, like I told you, a very well-known thing between a higher animal welfare and environmental aspects. If we would increase for layer hens, for example, the animal welfare up to the 1 star or 2 star, it would mean 15 to 70% more feed being used. And also for broilers, partly related to because they live longer than the regular broilers, but also because they have a little bit more space to move, and especially, of course, in the organic farming. So there's a trade-off here between the local aspects and animal welfare and the global challenges. But of course, there are also ways of solving that, and I think that's the way forward. I mean, to look at innovative productive systems, but not only address animal welfare, but also look at more global issues which combine animal health issues and solutions with environmental solutions, but also with societal needs. So I think the innovation is the way forward to go. Like, well, 2 examples here, but not that I really say these are the best ones, but I mean, I think the way of looking at it is very good, to look at an innovative, but also an integrated way to the solutions. And well, if we talk about nitrogen and phosphorus, recycling of manure is very important. Well, you can do it at the old-fashioned way by bringing back the manure to the fields where the cereals come from. Well, the Netherlands, because of our manure surplus, a lot of the poultry manure is being burned now and being used for electricity generation. But one of the concerns is that you should to reuse the minerals from the poultry manure. And it's not only about nitrogen and phosphorus, but there are a lot of trace elements incorporated, of course, in the manure. So the challenge is to bring back all the minerals from the farm to the crop areas. Well, if you talk about smarter global, but also smarter local. There's the FAO agenda for sustainable livestock production. I'm personally involved in the focus area number 1. It's called Closing the Efficiency Gap, and looking at manure, at methods, especially for developing countries, to increase the feed efficiency. For instance, for laying hens. Well, as an example from Novus, they have a project called the 300 Club in Uganda, where they try to increase the egg production to 300 eggs per year, and they have different ways of doing so. Well, if you talk about feeds, we could not only look at better feed efficiency, but of course there's a lot of research being done on that already, but we could also look at alternative feed sources, or at higher crop yields. But like I said, the increase in crop yield has slowed down over the last decade, so there's a really concern how to still increase crop yields in a sustainable way. Well, as a summary, there's a large ways in which livestock production, including poultry production, impacts agriculture on the environment. One is through biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions, the use of resources like nutrients. In general, the environmental effects of livestock production are larger than those of crop production. And there are different ways forwards, like consumption changes, globally smart and locally smart. And well, I didn't speak about how to really achieve this, more about the technical ways, but I think that initiatives from both the public actors and private actors are needed, and an important way forward is also to reconnect consumption and consumers with production again. Thank you.
Thank you for this interesting talk on the environmental impact of farm animals. The next speaker, I'll try to picture the presentation first. Does it look familiar? That's so I'd like now to introduce for the second time Professor Eddy de Kuiperen, still emeritus professor from Leuven University. Not much has changed since we heard him talk here for 1.5 hours ago. And his topic now is more back to to now and the future, how to intensify animal production in a respectable way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How to intensify animal production in a respectable way. Half of my talk, I go quite quickly through it because it covers partly, but with other figures, with other data, and presented in another way, as we have heard this morning and also by the previous speaker, Mr. Westhoek. The second half of my talk is somewhat different, related with the first one, with different figures, and there I go slowly through it. So a quick part, be patient a bit, and then the slow part. The challenge is to provide food, raw materials, and energy for more than 9 billion people in a sustainable way. We know that more than 800 million people are chronically underfed today, and we still have to feed 9 billion people for 2050. The problem is not just production, but efficient production can and will help, certainly in view of land use for feed and food production and for fuel production and so on, the competition we have heard of. These challenges are reinforced by the environmental impact of our industrial society and by climate change, also by the bio-based economy, because there is competition between food, energy, and raw material needs, the feed, food, fuel, fiber, fun, flour, whatever, the F's, you fill it in. And increasing wealth, and there will be my focus, increasing wealth is going together with increased consumption of animal products. Yeah? Now, 35% of crop production is already used for animal feed. The goals for sustainable food production, there will certainly be a paradigm shift from the upper part for 2050 to the lower part of 2050. We see now that biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions, unsustainable water withdrawal, water pollution are on the focus. And probably we will focus in a more equitable way on real food production, total agriculture production, food distribution and access, and resilience of the food system. This comes from a Nature paper, very interesting. Some of you may know that. Good. What are important strategies? We have to limit extension of our agricultural land. We just heard it. Certainly when it goes at the expense of forest, especially in tropical areas because they are the most vulnerable. Increasing food supply by reducing waste and an equitable distribution and perhaps also by the diet gap. Increasing efficiency of water and use and nutrient use for crop production and increasing total production as well as production efficiency of crops. And the latter part, we can do that by optimization in using genetic potential of crops, but also by increasing the genetic potential of crops. And in this, biotechnology may be a part of a second green revolution. At least that is what a number of people are presuming. And GMO crops are and may play an important role in that. Where are they produced? Well, you can see that if we look at the industrial countries and the developing countries, we see that the developing countries, the triangles, are even more prone in these GMO crops than industrial countries, but we see a steady increase over the last 20 years in that. The main countries, as you know, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, India are on this list. And what? Soybean, corn, cotton, and rape. And well, rapeseed. And well, in that order, where we see that soybean is number one, followed by corn. Why I show you this? Because these two crops are to a large extent used for animal feed. If we look at soybean, cotton, corn, and rape, that means the most four important. You see here the ratio on a world basis, and it's in area in million hectares of GMO crops versus conventional crops, and we see that most of the soybean are already GMO crops. The same is true for cotton, mainly in developing countries and in the United States, and for corn it's only 35%, for rape it's also 30%. It's interesting to see these figures. This is coming from a book of the Food and Agriculture Organization, Livestock's Long Shadow, very interesting with a wealth of data. And you see here in a number of countries the part in chicken feed, the part that is taken by maize, wheat, barley, sorghum, soy meal, and you see in most of the countries maize, but also soybean meal is an important constituent, and therefore GMO crops are often a very important constituent of it. In this graph of the world, I told you I go quickly to these. I hope not too quickly, but they will be on the internet available. You see in green and in orange, where are the amounts, the estimated feed surplus deficit. When it is in green, it's a surplus. In orange, it's a deficit. Well, you see where is the deficit and where is the surplus. This means that this will, to a large extent, also dictate the streams, the flows of feed from one part of the world to the other part of the world, as you can see. Yeah? The demand, 2050, 9 billion people, changing consumption pattern. It's interesting to look at this. We see the world population increasing over the last 50 years. We see the world meat consumption also increasing, but at a more rapid pace than the world population. So, in terms of demand, we have two very different opinions. There are a large scale of opinions, but I take the extremes. And one extreme that you hear often, the population pressure, and we heard it today a lot, population pressure will contribute to hunger and poverty if we don't pay attention. The other opinion is no, population pressure does not contribute. There is enough food on the world, but the distribution is unfair. And population growth is even a stimulating factor for development. What we often hear in Europe, when there is not enough young population, we are in trouble. Yeah? So very conflicting opinions. And in between these two, you have a lot of meanings. Yes? What about the supply? Again, two very conflicting opinions. One is the opinion, one extreme, we have to solve hunger in the world with modern technologies. More food without aerial expansion, saving the environment. We just heard it from Mr. Westhoek. Yes? And very often in audiences like this, you will hear this opinion number one. But in contrast with this, and in between again, you have a number of opinions, there is opinion number two. What you often hear by people of Greenpeace, Gaia, or pressure groups. No, we do not need a new green revolution and other modern technologies because we have seen that green revolution is not sustainable. It is not sustainable agriculture because it increases the gap between the poor and the rich. Is it that what we want? And there is too much animal production. So very conflicting, I give them for what they are, but very conflicting opinions. And I would like to focus, and then I come to my second part of my talk, and I go more slowly for that, animal production. A lot of critics on animal production and consumption. What do we observe first? There is an increased per capita income. And when there is an increase per capita income, we see everywhere in the world now, but also in the past, it was the same, increasing consumption of animal products and hence consumption. Yes? When we have more money, we eat more meat, or we drink more milk. 90% of the world cereal consumption is local, and a lot of this local cereal consumption is going to our animals that we eat then. And there is therefore an increasing demand for feed, which is a driving force after the increasing local cereal production. Can we show that in a number of graphs? Yes, we can. If you take your time range large enough, and you have to do that, over 5 years, you cannot say very much. Over 50 years or 40 years, you can. And this is a graph from 1960 to 2000, and it goes on. You see in the dots the cereal production, per capita cereal production. We see that we are over the top in terms of per capita cereal production, but our meat production is still increasing. And another graph. And this is quite complex, and I will not explain everything to it, but the last one is of particular interest here. If we look at the meat production in kilogram per person and the total meat production here, we look at the meat production here, these are the triangles, in developing countries per capita, and in the developed countries per capita. The total meat production is for developed countries here, for developing countries there. In other words, here you see a point where developing countries are producing more meat. There is more meat produced now already in the southern part, the so-called developing countries, than in our Western industrialized society. Yes? And this is a graph that show you more or less the same thing, and there are a lot of figures. I just want to focus on this one. If we look at the percentage of world total consumption, 1983-2020, and we look for beef, pork, and poultry, we see that they have an equal share. They are almost of similar importance. Yes, we have heard that today as well. But that's not my main point. My main point is if we look at the share in developed countries for beef, for pork, for poultry, or the total meat, 2/3 were in our industrialized world in 1983, and 1/3 in developing countries. 40 years later, 2020, we are close by, just the reverse. This is tremendous, ladies and gentlemen. Never seen such a shift. And we all know that, and we take our precautions. Every one of you who has worldwide industries, they have their houses in China or Brazil or some of these countries. We anticipated this already, yes? So we have to look at efficiency. If we say there is too much meat production and consumption, and it is a kind of waste in terms of competition for soil, for water, for fertilizer, so for the ecosystem Earth, there is an increasing demand but limited production capacity. So if that is the point of view that we heard today several times, then we have to do it in a more efficient way. But what is efficiency? Efficiency, by definition, mathematics, is a ratio. It is a ratio. You put something in the nominator and in the denominator. Well, we will look a little bit at efficiency. And I borrowed this figure. You can see that. It's a very old one. It's a figure from Leach, Mr. Leach from the UK. It dates from the 50s, the late 50s. And what he did, and I will do it today, I will look at efficiency from one single point of view, energy. Energetic efficiency. You can do that for protein efficiency or whatever. I look from the point of view of energy. Well, if we look at the energy input in agriculture systems and the energy output from agriculture systems to our use, input whatever, also fuel, and the output what we have available for us to eat. Yes? And he did that for very different agriculture systems, tropical systems, primitive systems, sophisticated systems, animal husbandry systems, fishery systems, whatever. And you see 3 lines. This line with E10, this line with E1, and this line with E0.1. What systems you find here? All the very primitive tropical systems where men are working with their hands, and he didn't calculate labor, human labor, but all the other things as input, energy input, he calculated, yes, at that time, 50 years ago. All these primitive systems are more or less on the line or above the line E10. That means 10 times more output in energy, food, feed, than input in energy. We go to our systems 50 years ago, we are here, a little bit above, but all animal husbandry systems are close to 1 or lower than 1. And eggs and poultry are even at 0.1. In other words, a waste. A waste in terms of the energy you put in and the energy you put out. Leach, 50 years ago or more. If we look from a biological point of view at efficiency, efficiency including the parent stock you need to reproduce your animals, yeah? Plus the feed you put in, the whole thing, yes? And we look at the energy efficiency here and protein efficiency for dairy cows, dual-purpose cattle, meat cattle, sheep, pigs, broilers, laying hens. Energetic efficiency, 12, 11, 5, 2, and so on. Protein efficiency is always a little bit higher. In other words, indeed, what is our improvement versus the biology who says that each step on the food pyramid, you lose 90% and 10% you take to the next step in the pyramid. In our modern agriculture systems, we hardly made a step forwards. We're still at that level. We sometimes forget that. But if you look at it, it's very different from one system to the other. And poultry are quite efficient, and pigs as well, versus meat, cattle, and sheep. So if you eat meat, eat chickens, eat pig, eat eggs, and no sheep and cattle. Lesson from that. Forget the lesson, but retain it for a couple of minutes. I go back to an American study, very interesting, where he looked at, in more detail, at megajoule per kilogram. Don't look at the figures. They are not right anymore. They are old. But the relative value of the figures is still valid today. And what he did is how much megajoule do we need as feed at the population level for 1 kilogram meat? For 1 kilogram meat, for beef, for lamb, for pork, for rabbit, for turkey, for chicken. And you see on these histograms that there are 6 parts. The 3 first ones and the 3 second ones, for all of them. The 3 last ones, half of it maintenance, protein, fat, maintenance, protein, fat, and you see that in all animal husbandry systems. The 3 first ones is the energy that goes for replacement animals, maintenance of the animal, and the lactation and gestation of the animal. So you have to count the whole thing for 1 kilogram edible meat. And you all see, again, for beef and for lamb, you need much more feed to produce 1 kilogram edible proteins for humans than for chicken and turkey. And for rabbit, it's also good. For pigs, it's a bit more. Why? Because these animals are multiparous, these is in between, and these are uniparous animals. It's as simple as that. So the breeding female is taking the biggest part of the total feed per kilogram meat that you produce if you produce beef or lamb. We forget about it. Again, the same conclusion. If you eat meat, it's a kind of a waste, so to say, but if you do it, eat chicken and don't eat beef and lamb. Yes? Good. You agree with me? I prove it, huh? Now, I come to some other definition. And Professor Van Ness, and some of them may know him quite well, very famous in the Netherlands and in Belgium as well, he says, yeah, but you're looking in the wrong way to these things. Everything that the animal needs is not edible by humans. So you should look at how much do we eat from the animal, yeah? And how much from what the animal eats is directly consumable for humans. There you have the competition between animals and man, and not the total energy. That makes no sense, because nobody of you is liking to eat grass in the savannah somewhere. No. Yes, but if you give grain and maize and soybean to your chicken, then you are able to eat that yourself. For DDGS, no, you will not like to eat that. But if you give, for example, cassava, manioc, yeah, in tropical countries, it's competition with human food. But here it's not, because you don't like to eat cassava. Perhaps, yes, I don't. Good. If you do that, and you look at these ratios, and you see here that there are 2, one column with 1 X here, and then with a double X, I go with the situation today. When you have plenty of food, and you look at these ratios, again, ratios of metabolizable energy available to you from animal products versus the metabolizable energy in animal feed that is also available to you if you want to eat that or if you eat it directly. Yes? So if your ratio is below 1, you lose. If your ratio is higher than 1, you gain. Broiler, laying hens, pigs, veal. Yes, why veal is there? Because we raise our veal on milk powder. Yeah? Dairy cows, 2.4. Meat cattle with a lot of concentrate, 0.41. Extensive, 1.3. Lamb on pasture, 2.4. Conclusion, that's, I prove to my students, don't eat chicken and pig, eat lamb. Eat beef. So I can prove whatever I want to you by numbers. Don't believe numbers, just first go for clear concepts. That's one of my messages. And the concept of efficiency is very different depending how you formulate it, how you define it, and why you define it in that way. What are the values behind? And then fill in the numbers. If you start with the numbers, I can prove everything. Yeah? Good. So, and efficiency is even more than conversion of unsuitable materials for human, like grass and NPN. That's the advantage of ruminants. Huh? It's also manure for soil improvement. I didn't take that into account. Grass is necessary in crop rotation. Large areas worldwide are only suitable for extensive grazing. We forget that 2/3 of the arable land is only suitable for extensive grazing. Perhaps we should keep our beeves there and not here. Yeah? But that's something else. So we have to go to a sustainable animal production. And we know that animal production and consumption is increasing. If it is increasing and we have this competition between man and their animals, we should go for a more sustainable animal production. Livestock farming with care, as we say. And what are the principles? These come from NIAS, from Martin Scholten. Health and safety of animals and man. We should look at it as one health. Customized care, ensuring robustness, dignity and integrity. Difficult words, not easy to understand. No nuisance from environmental or societal perspective, what we just heard. Credible performance from a socio-economic perspective. We still keep animals because we have to make a living out of it. We should gain money of it. We should not forget that. Huh? That's all very clear, and we can agree with that. But the implementation of the concrete measures, that's the challenge. And it should be in relation to the different types of animal husbandry practiced in developed and developing countries together. But what is careful livestock farming? In fact, it's a concept of values. And if it's a concept of values, it's an ethical concept. If it is an ethical concept, it has a layered meaning. A layered meaning, what does that mean? It means it is a theory of moral cycles. I will show you in a minute. Yeah? And it's also a chance or opportunity to reach caring, sustainable farming. I come back on this layered meaning theory of moral cycles because if we fill in careful livestock farming, it depends on what distance we look at it. And that is the meaning of these layers of increasing inclusivity. If we look at the definition of care on the basis of what we care for, ourselves, our income, and our loved ones, it is the inner circle. But if we broaden this a bit and we say, no, it's not just for ourselves, but it's for the farming community, this is a broader cycle. And if it's a broader cycle, it's also on the longer term. So the social distance is mostly going together with the temporal distance, with the time distance. If we say careful farming, we should define it broader, not just looking at the Dutch poultry farmers, for example, but all human beings, inclusive farm animals, or the human beings in general to start with. It's broader in the social dimension, but also in the temporal dimension. And if we say it's not only humans, but it's also the welfare of the animals, we should also take that into account on a world scale. Then we have, again, a broader social and temporal distance. And we should perhaps not only care of animals and man, but also of the biosphere, and perhaps of our future generation. You see, if we fill in the term careful farming, you can have a very different definition according to what layer you are facing or you are putting yourself in. Yeah? And you can do that in a very far in terms of temporal and social dimension, but then it will be very theoretical and sometimes not practical. But we should realize that you have a kind of layers of increasing inclusivity of care, as we say. Theoretical concept, but with practical consequences. One of the big items that I cannot develop today, but I would like to say something about it, is we all know that if we look at efficiency, selection has played a major role in our improving efficiency, improving production. But there are limits to it. And the selection limits for growth and feed efficiency, what are they? And why can they be reached? Well, they can be reached for two reasons. You can only select if you have variability. If you have no variability, no selection, because they are all the same. If you reach at a certain moment because of ongoing selection, certainly in the poultry business, yeah, because selection is going quite rapidly, at a certain moment your quantitative genetic variation is up is ended and you cannot go further anymore. Are we there already? The answer is no, we are not there. We still can go on. There is still an enormous variation, and we can go on for selecting probably for decades. But there's something else. Every time you select in a unidirectional way, and certainly in poultry business we go in one direction. Why? Because we have eggs or we have meat. And when we have meat, we care about growth and feed conversion. When we have eggs, we care about reproduction, egg production, and feed conversion. Yeah? Well, whenever you go very strongly in one or either direction, you have uncorrelated, unwanted, correlated responses associated with this selection. And that we start to see, and therefore all selection companies, you go downstairs, you ask them, all of them, yeah, they broaden their selection goals. And they include aspects as animal welfare, leg weaknesses, breast deformities, and so on, and so on, and so on. So that's quite clear. Robustness, a new term, not so new, we hear a lot about it, is selective breeding in terms of production, but including traits related to health and to welfare in order to improve this robustness. And robustness means we need a good production potential, but we also need animals that are resilient to external stressors. In other words, they have to have the physiological ability to maintain or to re-establish homeostatic state of balance. Yes, that's the way how we can understand robustness. And I see my time is almost up. One of the last slides is, if we look now in these paradigms and you put them in two axes, food safety, food supply, social poverty and concerns, environment, and we heard a lot about it. If you look at these four axes and you look at the shift, it's really a paradigm shift. Yeah? When you have low development, large number of smallholders, as we still have in a lot of African countries, some Asian countries, some South American countries. Well, where is the focus on? The focus is on social poverty concerns. We keep animals because we have to make a living of it, and we have to supply food. We don't care so much about food safety and about environment. But in the beginning of industrialization, and certainly in the phase of rapid industrialization, we see that there is a paradigm shift, and that these two here, and here we are in a post-industrial, as we say, stage, then we see that the shift from social poverty concerns is to environment, and from food supply to food safety. And that's what I always say. If we look at food safety and food security, these are two terms, ladies and gentlemen. In our society, food safety is there. Food security is there. We hardly care about food security. You go to the supermarket, you find whatever you want in tenfold. Food security, we don't know it anymore, because it's ready available for all of us as much as we want, and we eat too much. So food security, what is that, food security? But food safety, that means that what we do in terms of animal efficiency, I don't believe that we are on a good way. We throw away things because of the so-called food safety, things that are excellent sources, non-competitive for our unigastric animals like poultry. We just throw them away under the signs of food safety, and we don't care about food security. Do I give an example? Yes, I give two examples, and then we stop and we can discuss about it. We heard this morning DDGS. DDGS in the United States. You have tons of them. We are not allowed to use it in Europe because of some reasons we can discuss about it. The other thing, hot topic, we throw away animal proteins. Yes, we can supply. No, I should say it in another way. We can make that more than 40% to 50% of the total soybean import from South America, yeah, we don't have to do that if we allow to use good proteins in terms of meat and bone meal. But the claim, no cannibalism or food safety, another thing. Well, these are things that I, as a scientist, I like to challenge, yes, in terms of this unbalance we have between food safety and food security. And I guess it was my last slide. No, it's not. Future, animal use and human-animal relationship, we talked about it. It differs a lot, culture influences, but that we talked about it already. Artificial difference between species without fundamental biological difference, that was the former talk. Agriculture, animal or useful animal, important for food production, but also ecologically, and next to useful, often also a cultural role. Future sustainable agriculture, increasing demand for animal products and cereals versus vulnerability and bearing capacity of the ecosystem Earth. 75% of human foods exist of cereals, direct or indirect, and production and distribution. We need, and we really have a need for mondialization. We speak a lot about mondialization, but what we don't have is a mondialization of ethical principles with respect for socio-cultural and religious values. Respect for these values if we can, but a mondialization of the ethical principles of our animal production. And hereby I stop, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor De Kuyper. So that now brings us to, for me, the most challenging part of this afternoon, the panel discussion. And I hope you will all help me with that in participating in it. So I would first ask the speakers, the three speakers of this afternoon, to take place here on the podium.
I have a question for Henk Westhoek. Henk, as one of the solutions, you said we should have a fairer sharing of costs and benefit. My question is, who should take action for that? Farmers want a bigger piece of the total value, and everybody in the chain wants that, but and nobody wants to pay for that hidden cost. Who should take action, in your opinion?
Well, it's a difficult and challenging question, and not an easy answer, of course, to that. Well, I think it's part of kind of some kind of prisoner's dilemma. On the other hand, I think, well, like I said, reconnecting with, like also Henk showed. I mean, I think the general public should have a fair and a good idea about agricultural production, and also about the effects of, well, the desire of the retailers, but also of the consumers to have food products as cheap as possible. And if you would know that what the actual costs are, and for example, the cost of certain improvements are, and that could help in having a fairer price for people in the whole chain. And of course, there are initiatives. I mean, like in the Netherlands, for regional products, there are initiatives for where people voluntarily pay a high price for animal welfare, but also well, to go to farmers to buy directly, to pay a higher price, especially if you count in the time. So I think many people well, if you talk about fair trade and Oats coffee, for example, there are many examples where this is already happening. So I think people understand that, well, if you pay a low price, well, you also get the effects which are related to that. But it's not an easy question, not an easy answer, of course. Yeah.
Simone Herzberger of Royal Ahold, the Netherlands. I also have a question for Mr. Westhoek. In one of your first slides, you showed the growth of aerial soil ground in the world. I think it were your slides where you showed that it was growing. But I get the impression that that aerial regions are also there where people are growing wood, because the production woods in, for instance, Scandinavia are not natural areas, but this is production. And okay, the harvest, it takes 80 years before the wood is harvested, but there is no difference between harvesting grain or salad compared to harvesting trees. Okay, trees grow for 80 or 100 years, but it's production that is taking place there. So my question is, are these slides, they don't incorporate the production of wood? How are your views in this light? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, the slides I show were indeed about the extent of cropland being used worldwide, and well, I selected these because they have, together with grasslands, of course, they have the highest correlation with livestock production. We also have similar information on forests, and well, one of the I just made a selection, but we also have the other slides information available. There is, though, a difference between cropland production and forests. If you would look at the remaining biodiversity, there's a kind of sequence that's in forest, but depending a little bit on the type of forest, the remaining biodiversity is much higher than on croplands. We're only about 10% of the biodiversity, the original biodiversity, is remaining. In some cases, only 1 or 2%. And while grasslands are somewhere in between. I mean, if you talk about semi-natural grasslands, they still contain about 70% of the original biodiversity. So in terms of biodiversity, there's a big difference between croplands and forests. But it depends a little bit of the type of croplands and the type of forest. But in a general sense, there is still quite some difference.
Professor De Kuyper would be the first one to answer it. So there are a lot of demands on the animal production, both from the environment, society, ethics, welfare, diseases, climate. So how do we meet all these challenges at the same time, given that they are sometimes conflicted? So, I think it's a good question for a retired professor. And world peace, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. How can I answer that? I should start with the first part. Why do we keep animals for? And the first thing we keep animals for, at least agricultural animals, is for our food. So we should be concerned about efficiency of production, health of production, but in a respectable way. That means in a way of respect for our animals, that they don't suffer. Yeah? And in such a way as well, but it has to go together, that we, and I say we as farmers, so to say, can make a living of it. And there sometimes is the problem. In order to make a living of it, we have to keep such huge number of animals, because the profit per margin per animal that we make is so small that sometimes our profit seems to go against the profit of the animal, the welfare of the animal, or against its health. What to do about it? I don't know all the answers, but one thing I know, in my view at least, is that as farmers, although I am not a farmer myself, but I put myself on that position, our food is too cheap. That I believe, at farm level. Is it too cheap in the supermarket? That I don't know. Perhaps not. But I guess that the farmers today have not very much to say about the price of the chicken or the egg that they sell to the consumer or to the slaughterhouse. Who is determining this? I think probably to a large extent, but tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm only a professor, and I don't know all these practical things, but to a large extent, and for me, for a too large extent, it is dominated by the small number of retailers, yes. And I think there, perhaps we can do something to improve the income for our farmers so that they have more freedom, let us say, to cope with these other aspects now in the three-form people, profit, planet.
Okay. Yeah, this question that I'm now seeing is also a nice one for you, I think, Eddie. So you gave us a nice historical overview in your first lecture, and now this question says, so, well, picture yourself in the year 3000. Will we still eat meat, or will it be an act of crime?
We will still eat meat, because we, just as chickens and pigs and some other animals, we are made to eat whatever. We are, how you call it, omnivorous species. And 3000, that means 1,000 years from here, is in biological evolution too small to go from an omnivorous to an herbivorous status. So in 1,000 years, we will not become herbivorous. We will still be omnivorous. Yeah, I believe. I hope so. I hope so that we still can debate about 3000, the year 3000. I hope that we still will exist as a species.
I hope so too, but neither of us will be able to check it, I'm afraid.
No. The perspective is a little bit long.
Yeah, but given the remark that you say, well, we are an omnivores, I think we can easily agree on that. On the other hand, I think it was Henk Westhoek who showed us that the part of the diet, that if you look at the plant part of the diet, it's actually quite close to the level that we would need as protein. So from that point of, and I think also from the people who do not eat meat, it would be possible. And also given the last picture that Henk Wildhoek showed us, we could also produce the meat in vitro.
The latter I don't believe. We can, but okay, that's perhaps a belief, huh? But I don't believe.
Not so long ago, I couldn't believe that I can just Skype with my children wherever. I mean, this is a very, very new invention. You know, when I was young, we thought about it, and I didn't think it was ever going to happen, but it's now like a common thing. So I have a big hope for the future in this case.
Yes, I don't. And I don't. Why I don't? Because you will still need living cells from it, and you can grow meat on plastic spheres and make them extensions so that they differentiate into muscle cells. I know these techniques, it's done, but you will still need the primary material to grow them. Mm-hmm. That means you will need the amino acids. You will need the growth factors, whatever we need now to grow meat in dishes, which is totally different from the raw materials of which your GSM is made.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That's a big difference, yes. But just to comment a little bit on the question, yes, we can deal for a big extent on plant proteins, but if we have the choice, as long as we have a choice, if we have the choice between a good piece of meat and only raw cereals, for example, or whatever, well, we will choose to eat and the meat and the cereals. It's just like a chicken. If you give them corn and soybean and everything as a complete balanced diet, they will eat it and they will grow magnificently on it. But you keep your chickens in your backyard and they will eat the same diet. You give them a piece of offal of meat or from your kitchen, they will leave the green and eat the concentrate, and they will eat this piece of your kitchen.
Again, somebody from the audience. Goosen, again.
Yeah, I have a question for Henk Wildschut. Henk, you are an artist, and you told us today that you had a negative image of our industry, and then when you looked around for 1 year, you changed that. Well, when you tell that opinion here in the WPSA, of course, everybody likes that.
Yeah.
But I'm very curious, you are an artist, when you tell that in your environment, in the middle of Amsterdam, to other artists, what is their reaction? Do they believe you, or do they think that you are crazy, or?
Now, the discussions, as I told you on the birthday parties, were most of the times people start to realize that they didn't have so much knowledge. And when I started to the same today, when you throw around with figures and tell whatever you really know or what you investigated, people people start to think. So they were really going along with my story. So and I know that a lot of people in my surrounding changed their opinion too, and they started thinking about it. So I think education is also in this level is very important. And what Mr. De Kuyper also said, like we are so used to food security and that there is so much food, we don't think about it. It's almost the same as a telephone. You don't want to know what's in it. But food is something else, you know. So it's a basic necessity for our life, and in the West we forgot this.
Nice that you reflect on it, because it also I'll give you the word in a minute, but it also kind of relates to the question I now see on the screen, where we say, well, the perception that people have on the animal production. So you say, well, I use this phone and I don't. Well, actually, it's of moderate interest to me what's in it, but for animals, we should know it. It was also, I think, in Henk Westhoek's presentation, who said, well, we should be transparent. Whereas this questioner asks himself, well, is that really true, or is it actually that many people who live in cities don't like to know that actually an animal needed to be killed for the product they're eating? So that's actually an act which they deeply consider morally wrong.
I don't know. I think. Yeah, yes and no. We don't like to see how things are really going on in the slaughterhouse. That's true. And for example, my children, I have a very small vegetable garden, and when I take the fresh salad out of the garden, they think it's disgusting, because they know what's all going on in the ground. They prefer to eat the salad freshly made from the Albert Heijn. You know, and I think it's because they know there is no snail in it. You know, and it's the same a little bit with meat. I think and so again about Albert Heijn, I just told her I'm very happy that Albert Heijn put like an animal on the package now, and I think it should be more extreme, like show what's going on the package, instead of making all these nice things around it and not showing the reality.
So this barcode, that if you put your iPhone on it, that you immediately see a movie on how it was produced.
Yeah, for example. And also another thing which I think is very important, that not only like animal rights stars should be on it, but also environmental impact. I think like the broiler chicken will be a different. There will be a different opinion around broiler chickens when you see the environmental impact compared to biological.
So, question in the back. You have been waiting already for a long time.
Yeah, actually my question is very related to the previous one, also for Henk. You showed all kind of images and you showed the commercials. and also the children's book of a farm, and it's all romantic. How would you suggest now to show the images? How would you suggest to, well, what kind of images are we showing our children? What kind of images should we show in commercials?
Well, I think we should show them both, because I think like it's not like one or the other, but it's the combination between those. You know, the nostalgic way, but also the industrial way. But it's a little bit more complicated to take my children to an industrial farm because it's not possible for them to go inside. You know, so I think farmers should be a little bit more transparent. Maybe not all of them, but like maybe there should be a sort of showcase farms where you can just go in and have a look. But on the other hand, I think it's for the industry, it's also it's like clear that it's just not possible to just be transparent in everything. But I think they have to communicate why they are not transparent, because it's just a production economic problem to do. But show as much as you can also, yeah, I think.
Case?
Jan Kees van der Wijngaard. In the 80s of the last century, my wife made a photo documentary. Let's say the name was Our Daily Poultry Meat. It was not for the Rijksmuseum Amsterdam, it was for the school where our children went every day. To the opinion of most parents of the children on our school, it was an act of total cruelty to show these photos to the little children. And this brings me to the question to the panel, what is the role of education to solve part of the problem? I don't know who has to answer, maybe the chairman can make the decision.
So we just go from left to right? Left. For the viewers, left.
Yeah, Jan Kees, who am I to answer your question? But I think for me, and also for my children, death is part of life. Killing our animals is not morally wrong. Let them suffer deliberately is morally wrong. Let suffer humans is morally wrong. That's why there is such debate in a lot of countries about euthanasia for humans.
So your answer is education is important.
Education is important. And in this education, there is a truth in life, and that is that death is part of life. And we should not hide that. What I have the impression in our society is sometimes that we hide these things too much for humans, but also for our animals. We should not hide it.
I also do believe that education is very important and should be an integrated part of education at primary and secondary schools. Not only agriculture, but I think food as well. And what is also scaring me is the easy belief of the public in certain healthy food products, for example. And I think some more education could make people a little bit more resilient against all kinds of new trends, etc., how to eat certain berries or not, or to eat certain cereals or not, or whatever. So I think it should be combined, food and agriculture, and also see the connection between the two, so that the impact of food choices on the environment, for example, but also on your own health. And I think that would really help to have a healthier and better society.
Well, if I have to add something to it, I think the education is not only for educational institutes, but also for the industry itself. I think they need to take much more responsibility to communicate the real story. Well, that's probably the story of my whole thing, but I really believe so, and also for the government.
I know you have to leave soon, but
Yeah.
then one question that was still in my mind and that I would like to have your opinion on it. So you started by showing us that, well, with pictures you can tell any story you like. Then I'm a scientist, so I believe in numbers, but in the end we had Professor De Kuyper who convincingly demonstrated that also with numbers you can tell any story you like. So just being, so for this topic I'm a bit in it, so I have thought about it a little bit more. But what would your advice be to the general public? Because it at least to me, it seems extremely difficult for them to get a realistic picture on it. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult to get a real picture, because today I learned also a lot of things more, and I had to re-evaluate opinions I had before. So I think, yeah, I think we have to communicate that it's very complicated, and that people have to think, you know, like and not believe like one side or the other side, but go and maybe we have to challenge them to start rethinking their old values. And well, I think it's going to be a big challenge, but it's also a very interesting one.
So thank you. Yes, please.
I'm from Ontario, Canada, and I just want to, in the interest of the last 3 questions or comments, want to bring the 3 together, the education and transparency and so on, and commend you to Google. Food and Farm Care is an organization in Ontario which has brought together the various livestock industries, and we offer virtual farm tours through that website. And so it's education, it's transparency, and you know, bringing them all together and helping the average person to learn a little bit more. And also we've taken upon ourselves as livestock farmers and the organizations, you know, to do our part too in getting that story out there. Sorry, I can't tell you exactly what the website is, but the organization is Food and Farm Care, and it's based in Ontario, Canada.
Thank you. Any further questions from the audience? Then I close with the final one, because that seemed to me the most challenging one. So Eddie, in one of your final slides you showed us a solution that the ethical standards should be more harmonized worldwide. And then I thought, my God, how is he going to do that?
I will not. It's a never-ending story and an ongoing discussion. And in that, communication is important. And we still need that communication. But if I go on with that, communication, what is communication then? For communication, you need one person communicating to the other. That means that you need to have a language to communicate. But if I communicate in Dutch and my partner is a Chinese who does not know Dutch and I do not know Chinese, that means that we have a communication, we have the vehicle of communication, a language, but we will not understand each other. That means that in communication, we should try at least to understand each other with people of very different backgrounds. And very different backgrounds, that I mean by this not different languages, but different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, who still play a quite important role in these discussions. For example, look at killing the animals. The Dutch law says that you have to anesthetize the animal. Some religious persons will say, no way, it is not allowed. I mean this by communication.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
So it's 5 o'clock now, the time for the closure of this session. I'm really glad you're all here. I'm really glad that you made my job, this unexpected job for me this afternoon, easy in participating very well in this discussion. I would like to thank the speakers for their talks and their participation in the discussion, and I would like to help you in thanking them again for their magnificent job. And Ria is now giving them a small token of our appreciation.
Sorry. Yeah, and as Elanco, we sponsored the contribution of Henk Wildschut, and therefore I got the right to say a special thanks to Henk. Henk, you started telling us that in your lifetime the world population doubled. In the next 30 to 40 years, it will probably have another additional 3 billion of people on the world, and therefore the demand for meat, milk and eggs will go up, especially because the middle class in the world will increase from 2 billion to 5 billion. So with this increased demand, we will have to produce more with less. And we learned an important lesson from you. We learned that in order to develop a vision for that, we need to see the total picture. And you showed us part of the total picture in animal production. But more important, the consumer needs to see the total picture. So in agriculture, we need to communicate better and more. Using pictures, probably. We need to communicate the need for intensive farming and the need for technology. And only then we will be able to feed the world in the future. We bought a book for you, and it is called What the World Eats. So, the world eats a lot of things, and I hope in 50 years, it's about the time you will retire. This will be an inspiration for you to maybe to redo the book and see and show us what the world eats at the time.
And probably in 50 years I will retire because I don't have a pension. Thank you very much. I really like this book, and it was not in my collection yet, so I'm very happy with it.
For the other speakers, we also have a book, and that is the book of Henk Wildschut. So we couldn't present him his own book, so that we reserved for the others. And for Henk Westhoek, there is also some other thing, because the others are sponsored, and Henk didn't want to have any money, as he is from the government, so you get some extra.